unbridled exploitation of personal data, the proliferation of disinformation, and have seen how algorithmic biases can perpetuate discrimination and prejudice, and how the lack of transparency can undermine public trust. This is disinformation, housing discrimination, harassment of women and impersonation fraud, voice cloning, deep fakes. These, for me, perhaps the biggest nightmare is the looming new industrial revolution, the displacement of millions of workers, the loss of huge numbers of jobs, the need to prepare for this. Already industry leaders are calling attention to those challenges. To quote ChatGPT, this is not necessarily the future that we want. We need to maximize the good over the bad. Congress, we have the obligation to do it on AI before the threats and the risks become real. Sensible accountability is not a burden, far from it. They start with transparency, researcher access. We can establish scorecards and nutrition labels to encourage competition based on safety and trustworthiness, and ban their use, especially when it comes to commercial invasions of privacy for profit and decisions that affect people's livelihoods. And if AI companies and their clients cause harm, they should be held liable. We ought to beware of the garbage, whether it's going into these platforms or coming out of them. And
I was talking with someone just last night, a researcher in the field of psychiatry, who was pointing out to me that the ChatGPT and generative AI, these large language models, it's really significant than that. We could be looking at one of the most significant technological innovations in human history. And I think it's going to be like the printing press that diffused knowledge and power and learning widely across the landscape, that empowered ordinary, everyday individuals, that led to greater flourishing, that led above all to greater liberty? Or is it going to be more like the atom bomb? Huge to this day. I don't know the answer to that question. Our adversaries and all around the world, until we strike that balance between technological innovation and our ethical and moral responsibility to humanity, to liberty, to the freedom of this country.
And technology are a qualitative change. The suggestions that I've heard from experts in the field suggest it's qualitative. Is it AI fundamentally different? Is it a game changer? Is it so disruptive that we need to treat it differently than other forms of innovation? I'm glad that this hearing is taking place, and I think it's important for all of us to participate. I'm going to have to scramble to keep up with the pace of innovation in terms of our government.
Behind ChatGPT and DALL-E, Mr. also chairs IBM's AI Ethics Board, a multidisciplinary team responsible for the governance of AI and emerging technologies. Christine's a scientist, best-selling author, and entrepreneur. Challenges to contemporary AI, anticipating many of the current limitations decades in advance.
And nearly every aspect of our lives, but also that it creates serious risks. We are here because people love this technology. We think it can be a printing press moment. We have to work together to make it so. We are governed by a nonprofit, and our activities are driven by our mission and our charter, which commit us to working to ensure that the broad distribution of the benefits of AI and to maximizing the safety of AI systems.
AI is not new, but it's certainly having a moment. Recent attention has rightfully raised serious questions at the heart of today's hearing. What are AI's potential impacts on society? What do we do about bias? What about misinformation, misuse, or harmful content generated by AI systems?
Of increasingly powerful models for development and release of AI models above a threshold of capabilities. They're adhered to a set of safety requirements, facilitating processes to develop and update safety measures, and examining opportunities for global coordination. And it is a remarkable time to be working on artificial intelligence. But as this technology advances, we understand that people are anxious about how it could change the way we live. We are too. But so that we can all enjoy the tremendous upsides. It is essential that powerful AI is developed with democratic values in mind, and this means that US leadership is critical. Technology's potential to grow the US economy and the world's. And questions. Thank you.
To that end, IBM urges Congress to adopt a precision regulation approach to AI. This means establishing rules to govern the deployment of AI in specific use cases, not regulating the technology itself. Such an approach would involve 4 things. First, different rules for different risks. The strongest regulation should be applied to use cases with the greatest risks to people and society. Second, clearly defining risks. There must be clear guidance on AI uses or categories of AI-supported activity that are inherently high risk. This common definition is key to enabling a clear understanding of what regulatory requirements will apply in different use cases and contexts. Third, be transparent. So AI shouldn't be hidden. Consumers should know when they're interacting with an AI system and that they have recourse to engage with a real person should they so desire. No person anywhere should be tricked into interacting with an AI system. And impact assessments that show how their systems perform against tests for bias and other ways that they could potentially impact the public and to attest that they've done so. Congress can mitigate the potential risks of AI without hindering innovation. But with AI, the stakes are simply too high. The era of AI cannot be another era of move fast and break things. What we need at this pivotal moment is clear, reasonable policy and sound guardrails.
These other risks too, many stemming from the inherent unreliability of current systems. A law professor, for example, was accused by a chatbot of sexual harassment, untrue, and it pointed to a Washington Post article that didn't even exist. The more that happens, the more that anybody can deny anything. As one prominent lawyer told me on Friday, defendants are starting to claim that plaintiffs are making up legitimate evidence. These sorts of allegations undermine the abilities of juries to decide what or who to believe. A month after GPT-4 was released, OpenAI released ChatGPT plugins, which quickly led others to develop something called AutoGPT, with direct access to the internet, the ability to write source code. We want, for example, for our systems to be transparent, to protect our privacy, to be free of bias, and above all else, to be safe. But current systems are not in line with these values. Current systems are not transparent. They do not adequately protect our privacy, and they continue to perpetuate bias. And even their makers don't entirely understand how they work. Why should we? The sums of money at stake are mind-boggling. AI is moving incredibly fast with lots of potential, but also lots of risks. We obviously need government involved, and we need the tech companies involved, both big and small. But we also need independent scientists. Not just so that we scientists can have a voice, but so that we can participate directly in addressing the problems and evaluating solutions. And not just after products are released, but before. And ultimately, we may need something like CERN, global, international, and neutral, but focused on. We have unprecedented opportunities here, but we are also facing a perfect storm of corporate AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever, already changing things more rapidly than acted too slowly with social media. Many choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
GPT makes mistakes, all people call hallucinations. That might be impersonated, mine, in this instance, or quotes from research papers that don't exist. Those kinds of mistakes can be deeply damaging.
The model are also important. And
intelligence is probably the greatest threat to the continued existence of humanity. And let me ask you what your biggest nightmare is and whether you share that concern.
Like with all technological revolutions, I expect there to be significant impact on jobs, but the jobs of today will get better. And so you see already people that are using GPT-4 to do their job much more efficiently by helping them with tasks. Now, it will create new ones that we believe will be much better. There will be an impact on jobs.
And it's one that we've been talking about for a really long time at IBM, for partnering with AI technologies and using them.
What do they memorize and what new things do they do? Second, that we have much greater transparency about what actually goes into these systems. I think in the long run, so-called artificial general intelligence really will replace a large fraction of human jobs. And there's just no way around that. And
I think jobs and employment and what we're all going to do with our time really matters. I think that could happen in a lot of different ways. It's why we started the company happening, but we try to be very clear-eyed about what the downside case is and the work that we have to do to mitigate that.
I'm trying to understand its capacities and then its significance. So I'm looking at a paper here entitled Large Language Models Trained on Media Diets Can Predict Public Opinion. They go through and model why this is the case, and they conclude ultimately that an AI system can predict human survey responses by adapting a pre-trained language model to subpopulation-specific media diets. In other words, ahead of time. I mean, predict. It's before you even ask the public these questions. What will happen when entities, whether it's corporate entities or whether it's governmental entities or whether it's campaigns or whether it's foreign actors, responses? I mean, we already know, this committee has heard testimony, I think 3 years ago now, about the effect of something as prosaic, it now seems, as Google search, the effect that this has on voters in an election, particularly undecided voters in the final days of an election who may try to get information from Google search, and what an enormous effect the ranking of the Google search, the articles that it returns has come an enormous effect on an undecided voter. Language models that can predict survey opinion and then can help organizations, entities fine-tune strategies to elicit behaviors from voters. Should we be worried about this for our elections?
Yeah, thank you, Senator Hawley, for the question. It's one of my areas of greatest concern, the more general ability of these models to manipulate, to persuade, to provide sort of one-on-one interactive disinformation.
I think the scenario you raised was that we might basically observe people and use surveys to figure out what they're saying. But as Sam just acknowledged, the risk is actually worse, that the systems will directly, maybe not even intentionally, manipulate people. And that was the thrust of the Wall Street Journal article. And I guess Sam knows, but the rest of us do not. And what it is trained on has consequences for essentially the biases of the system. We could talk about that in technical terms. But how these systems might lead people about depends very heavily on what data is trained on them. And so about anything, these systems absorb a lot of data, and then what they say reflects that data. And they're going to do it differently depending on what's in that data. So it makes a difference if they're trained on the Wall Street Journal as opposed to the New York Times or Reddit. I mean, actually, they're...
AI systems trained on personal data, the kind of data that, for instance, the social media companies, the major platforms, Google, Meta, et cetera, can't we foresee an AI system that is extraordinarily good at determining what will grab human attention and what will keep an individual's attention? I'm just imagining an AI system, these AI models supercharging that war for attention such that we now have technology that will allow individual targeting of a kind we have never even imagined. We'd be concerned about that for its corporate applications, for the monetary applications, for the manipulation that could come from that. Mr. Altman.
Predictions of what a user will like. I think that's already happening in many ways.
Of course, now they're working for Microsoft, and I don't know what's in Microsoft's thoughts, but we will definitely see it.
But these issues are hugely important issues, and it's why we've been out ahead in developing the technology that will help to ensure that you can do things like produce a fact, data sheets, model cards, all those types of things, and calling for, as I've mentioned today, transparency. So you know what the algorithm was trained on, and then you also know and can manage and monitor continuously over the life cycle of an AI model, the behavior and the performance of that model.
I can't recall when we've had people representing large corporations or private sector entities come before us and plead with us to regulate them. In fact, many people in the Senate have based their careers on the opposite, that the economy will thrive if government gets the hell out of the way. We decided that in Section 230 that we were basically going to absolve the industry from liability for a period of time as it came into being, and that developers like OpenAI should not be entitled to full immunity for harms caused by their products. This is a new industry. Don't overregulate it. In fact, give them some breathing space and see what happens. I don't want to repeat that mistake again. And what I hear is the opposite suggestion from the private sector, and that is come in on the front end of this thing and establish some liability standards, precision regulation.
We think that technology needs to be deployed in a responsible and clear way, that we've taken principles around that, trust and transparency, we call them, are principles that were articulated years ago, and build them into practices. That's why we're here advocating for precision regulatory approach. So we think that AI should be regulated at the point of risk, essentially, and that's the point at which technology meets society.
As you said, Mr. Altman, things can go quite wrong. As you said, Mr. Marcus, democracy is threatened. I mean,
the amount of information to keep up on is so much. I think we need a lot of technical expertise, and each agency does their own thing. But I think that AI is going to be such a large part of our future and is so complicated and moving so fast. In this article in The Economist, I have a link in here, an invited essay for The Economist, suggesting we might want an international agency for AI. And that makes me feel like it might be possible. I would like to see the United States take leadership in such organization. It has to involve the whole world and not just the US to work properly. That wouldn't be a good way of operating. When you think about the energy costs alone, just for training these systems, it would not be a good model if every country has its own policies, and for each jurisdiction, every company has to train another model, and maybe different states are different. So Missouri and California have different rules, and so then that requires even more training of these expensive models with huge climate impact nation. And so I think that we might get the companies on board if there's bipartisan support here, and I think there's support around the world, that it is entirely possible that we could develop such a thing. But obviously there are many nuances here of diplomacy that are over my pay grade.
Mr. Altman.
I want to echo support for what Mr. Marcus. There is precedent. We've done it before with the IAEA. We've talked about doing it for other technologies. Given what it takes to make these models, the chip supply chain, the sort of limited number of competitive GPUs, the power the US has over these companies, I think there are paths to the US setting some international standards that other countries would need to collaborate with and be part of that are actually workable, even though it sounds on its face like a impractical.
And in fact, I think we're going to hear more about what Europe is doing. The European Parliament already is acting on an AI. We need to be in the lead.
Are you considering protections for content generators and creators in generative AI?
Yes, we are absolutely engaged on that. Again, to reiterate my earlier point, we think that content creators, content owners need to benefit from this technology. They can change it, they can test the accuracy of it. If they don't like it, they can get another version. But it still then spreads through social media or other ways. Like ChatGPT is a single player experience where you're just using this. And so I think as we think about what to do, that's important to understand. I think this is an area where hopefully the entire industry and the government can work together quickly. There's many approaches, and I'll talk about some of the things we do, but before that, I think it's tempting to use the frame of social media. But this is not social media, this is different, and so the response that we need is different. This is a tool that a user is using to help generate content more efficiently than before.
And Senator Blackburn was getting at some of this with song rights, and I have serious concerns about that. But news content. So Senator Kennedy and I have a bill that was really quite straightforward that would simply allow the news organizations an exemption to be able to negotiate with basically Google and Facebook. Microsoft was supportive of the bill. So are going to be gone by 2025 unless you start compensating for everything from movies, books, yes, but also news content. We're going to lose any realistic content producers. And so I'd like your response to that. And of course, there is an exemption for copyright in Section 230.
Having a vibrant national media is critically important, and let's call it round one of the internet has not been great for that.
Right, we're talking here about local, that, report on your high school football scores and a scandal in your city council, those kinds of things. But do you understand that this could be exponentially worse in terms of local news content if they're not compensated?
Well,
because what they need is to be compensated for their content and not have it stolen.
if there are things that we can do to help local news, we would certainly like to. Again, I think it's critically important.
Okay. Why don't you just say yes or no, and then go at his...
We need to know more about how the models work. We need to have scientists have access to them. I was just going to amplify your earlier point about local news. A lot, I will get it to your office, showing that something like 50 websites are already generated by bots. We're going to see much, much more of that, and it's going to make it even more competitive for the local news organizations. And so the quality of the sort of overall news market is going to decline as we have more generated content by systems that aren't actually reliable in the content they're generated.
Ms. Montgomery.
I think it comes back again to transparency and explainability in it. So disclosure of the data that's used to train AI, disclosure of the model and how it performs, and making sure that there's continuous governance over these models, that we are the leading edge. And the rules should be focused on the use of AI in certain contexts. So if you look at, for example, so if you look at the EU AI Act, it has certain uses of AI that it says are just simply too dangerous and will be outlawed in the EU.
Okay.
Introduce something to 100 million people, somebody has to have their eyeballs on it.
There you go. Okay. That's a good one.
Number three would be funding geared towards things like AI constitution, AI that can reason about what it's doing.
Important there, but specific tests that a model has to pass before it can be deployed into the world. And then third, I would require independent audits. So not just from the company or the agency, but experts who can say the model is or isn't in compliance with these stated safety thresholds and these percentages of performance on question X or Y.
And we need to get the regulation of this tool right, because my staff, for example, it might have been, I don't know, one of the other entities to create a song that my favorite band, BTS, a favorite song, a song that they would sing, somebody else's song, but just keep it short.
Yeah, I'll give a few examples. One would be about violent content.
Okay.
Another would be about content that's encouraging self-harm. Another is adult content. Not that we think adult content is inherently harmful, but there's things that could be associated with that we cannot reliably enough differentiate, so we refuse all of it. And that's where I personally think we need such a scheme.
I agree, and that is why by the time we're talking about AGI, we're talking about major harms that can occur through the use of AGI. So
I don't know how to build a system that understands harm in the full breadth of its meaning. So what we do right now is we gather examples and we say, is this like the examples that we have labeled before? But that's not broad enough. And so I thought your questioning beautifully outlined the challenge that AI itself has to face in order to really deal with this. We want, on this second part of your question, the model that I tend to gravitate towards, but I am not an expert here, is the FDA, at least as part of it, in terms of you have to make a safety case and say why the benefits outweigh the harms in order to get that license. Probably we need elements of multiple agencies. I'm not an expert there, but I think that the safety case part of it is incredibly important. You have to be able, what AutoGPT does is it allows systems to access source code, access the internet, and so forth. And there are a lot of potential, let's say, cybersecurity risks there.
I think that based on what I'm hearing today, don't you think that we're probably going to need to do a heck of a lot more than to focus on what use it is being AI. You can ask the same AI tool to generate something that is like an election fraud kind of a situation.
So I'm frankly excited to explore how we can facilitate positive AI innovation that benefits society while addressing some of the already known harms and biases that stem from the development and use of the tools today. Now, with things that most research into evaluating and mitigating fairness harms has been concentrated on the English language. While we've seen this problem before, and I'll tell you why I raise this. Social media companies, for example, have not adequately invested in content moderation tools and resources for their non-English in non-English language. So I'm deeply concerned about repeating social media's failure in AI tools and applications.
So having diverse people that are actually training those tools, considering the downstream effects as well. So we were one of the first teams and companies to put toolkits on the market, deploy them, contribute them to open source. That will.
Can you speak just for a second specifically to language inclusivity?
Technology is focused on and available in many languages.
Thank you. Now, this technology has a different opportunity and risk profile than other AI tools, and these applications have felt very tangible for the public due to the nature of the user interface and the outputs that they produce. But I don't think we should lose sight of the broader AI ecosystem as we consider AI's broader impact on society, as well as the design of appropriate safeguards. So, Ms. Montgomery, in your testimony, as you noted, AI is not new. Can you highlight some of the different applications that the public and policymakers should also keep in mind as we consider possible regulations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the generative AI systems that are available today are creating new issues that need to be studied. New issues around the potential to generate content that could be extremely misleading, deceptive, and the like. So those issues absolutely need to be studied. But we shouldn't also ignore the fact that AI is a tool. It's been around for a long time. It has capabilities beyond just generative capabilities. And again, that's why I think going back to this approach where we're regulating AI where it's touching people and society is a really important way to address it.
Things like that.
With massive data sets.
I think we don't know the answer to that for sure, but let's say it can at least have some impact there.
Okay, so we may be confronted by situations where, for example, a law enforcement agency deploying such technology seeks some kind of judicial consent to execute a search or to take some other police action on the basis of a modeled prediction about some individual's behavior. But that's very different from the kind of evidentiary predicate that normally police would take to a judge in order to get a warrant. Talk me through how you're thinking about that issue.
Yeah, I think it's very important that we continue to understand that these are tools that humans use to make human judgments and that we don't take away human judgment. I don't think that people should be prosecuted based off of the output of an AI system, for example. Yes?
Or is it the act itself acts only when actually executed?
Well, believer in defense in depth. I think that there should be limits on what a deployed model is capable of and then what it actually does too.
How are you design these systems in order to maximize the engagement of all users, including children, with perverse results in many cases? And what I would humbly advise you will look very harshly on the deployment of technology that harms children.
Second, these systems do have the capability to influence in obvious and in very nuanced ways. And I think that's particularly important for the safety of children, but that will impact all of us. One of the things that we'll do ourselves, regulation or not, but I think a regulatory approach would be good for also, is requirements about how the values of these systems are set and how these systems respond to questions that can cause influence.
We have emissions crises and the like. Not doing so for social media has been, I think, very destructive and allowed a lot of things to go on that are really causing a lot of harm. We don't know all of them. We really don't. We can't see where this is going. And you sort of called not for an agency, and I think when somebody else asks you to specify, because you don't want to slow things down. Agency that could do monitoring, other things, you can imagine.
Technology, and to understand emerging risks as well, so yes.
Some genies are already out, but we don't have machines that can really, for example, self-improve themselves there. So there are other genies to be concerned about.
And I see, OpenAI backed by Microsoft, Anthropic is backed by Google, and the associated risks perhaps with market concentration in AI. And then Mr. Marcus, can you answer that as well?
Again, I put something in the record about the Wall Street Journal about how these systems can subtly shape our belief.
Sam, I'm sorry.
One more thing I wanted to add. One thing that I think is very important is that what these systems get aligned to, whose values, what those bounds are, that is somehow set by society as a whole, by governments as a whole. And
number 3 is a member who served in the House and now in the Senate, and now about AI that relate to fundamental privacy rights, bias rights, intellectual property. There's the economic transformation, which can be profound there's safety concerns. Its scope of engagement it has to be defined by us. Last year, I introduced in the House side, and Senator Bennett did in the Senate side, it was the end of the year, Digital Commission Act, and we're going to be reintroducing that this year. And Congress established an independent commission when railroads were running rampant over the interest of farmers, when Wall Street had no rules of the road, and we had the SEC. And I think, what are some of the perils of an agency that we would have to be mindful of in order to make certain that its goals of protecting many of those interests I just mentioned, privacy, bias, intellectual property, disinformation?
One of the things I would add to the list is the risk of not holding companies accountable for the harms that they're causing today.
Kind of flavor here.
We need to hold companies responsible today and accountable for AI that they're deploying. That risk.
A regulatory agency would do a lot of the things that Senator Graham was talking about. You don't build an AI system without getting a license that gets tested independently.
Dominance of markets that excludes new competition and thereby inhibits or prevents innovation and invention, which we have seen in social media, as well as some of the old industries, airlines, automobiles, and others where consolidation has narrowed competition, and the threats that are posed by some of our adversaries. China has been mentioned here, but the sources of threats to this nation in this space are very real and urgent.
New AI that is self-aware and so forth?
Yes.
I mean, I have no idea on that one. I think we don't really understand what self-awareness is, and so it's hard to put a date on it. In terms of self-improvement, there's some modest self-improvement in current systems, but one could imagine a lot more. And the thing that is absolutely paramount, I think, is far greater transparency about what the models are and what the data are. That doesn't necessarily mean everybody in the general public has to know exactly what's in one of these systems, but I think it means that there needs to be some enforcement arm that can look at these systems, can look at the data, can perform tests, and so forth.
And coming back to the points of transparency, knowing what content was generated by AI is going to be a really critical area that we need to address.
I think we need to be concerned about internet access for these tools when they can start making requests, both of people and internet things. It's probably okay if they just do search, but as they do more intrusive things on the internet, like do we want them to be able to order equipment or order, Sam alluded to it briefly. I don't think that's where we are right now, but as we start to approach machines that have a larger footprint on the world beyond just having a conversation, we need to worry about that and think about how we're going to regulate that and monitor it and so forth.
In a sense, we've been talking about bad guys or certain bad actors manipulating AI to do harm.
Dennett just sent me a manuscript last night that will be in the Atlantic in a few days on what he calls counterfeit people. It's a wonderful metaphor. These systems are almost like counterfeit people, and we don't really honestly understand what the consequence of that is. And that introduces lots of problems, for example, cybercrime and how people might try to manipulate markets and so forth. So it's a serious concern.
In my opening, I suggested 3 principles: transparency, accountability, and limits on use.
I think those 3 would be a great start. I mean, there are things like the White House Bill of Rights, for example, that show.
I certainly agree that those are important points. I would add that, and Professor Marcus touched on this, I would add that as we spent most of the time today on current risks, and I think that's appropriate, and I'm very glad we have done it, as these systems do become more capable, and I'm not sure how far away that is, but maybe not super far. I think it's important that we also spend time talking about how we're going to confront those challenges.
Having talked to you privately,
Loss of jobs, invasion of privacy, personal privacy, on a scale we've never before seen, manipulation of personal behavior, manipulation of personal opinions, and potentially the degradation of free elections in America. Were they right? Do you join those calls? Are they right to do that? Should we pause for 6
Your
months? Or
characterization's not quite correct. I actually signed that letter, about 27,000 people. I don't know that we need to pause that particular project, but I do think its emphasis on focusing more on AI safety, on trustworthy, reliable AI is exactly right.
deployment means not making it available to the public?
Yeah, so,
You'd pause that?
my concern review, I think that we should think very carefully about doing
protocols.
Okay, the point about practicality leads me to this. I'm interested in this talk about an agency, and maybe that would work. Although, having seen how agencies work in this government, they usually get captured by the interests that they're supposed to regulate.
The plan that you propose, I think, as a hypothetical, would certainly make a lot of lawyers wealthy, but I think it would be too slow to affect a lot of the things that we care about, and there are gaps in the law. For example, we don't really
Wait,
know.
you think it'd be slower than Congress?
Actor. We have some laws around market manipulation we could apply, but we get in a lot of situations where we don't really know which laws apply. There would be I think that that's something a lot of people speculated about this afternoon, but it's not. Well, the question is how.
Oh, easy. It would be easy for us to say that Section 230 doesn't apply to generative AI.
But the destructiveness that I've also seen as a person that's seen the transformative technologies of a lot of the technologies of the last 25 years is what really concerns me. And one of the things, especially with companies that are designed to want to keep my attention on. And Sam, this is again why I find your story so fascinating to me and your values that I believe in from our conversations. What happens when they are the ones that are dominating this technology as they did before, might control this whole area?
I radically changed the shape of my own life in the last. We'd still have trouble with physical reasoning, psychological reasoning that it would be favorable. And then there was the famous article by Kevin Roose in which it recommended he get a divorce. And I had seen Tay and I had seen Galactica. And Sydney clearly had problems. But the amount of power that these systems have to shape our views and our lives is really, really significant. And I need to work on policy. This is frightening.
And Sam, I want to give you an opportunity for I know so many of the players in the Valley, from VC folks, angel folks, to a lot of founders of companies that we all know.
I think it's important to democratize the inputs to these systems, the values that we're going to allow is required. And so I think there needs to be incredible scrutiny on us and our competitors.
Of course, my team works on a lot of issues about the reinforcing of bias through algorithms. I think going to be very centralized to a few players who already control so much.
It is definitely important to talk about who's going to create the models. But in terms of using the models, the people that build on top of the OpenAI API do incredible things. I think that's quite exciting. And
I'll say, Chairman, as I close, that most industries resist even reasonable regulation, from seatbelt laws to we've been talking a lot recently about rail safety. The only way we're going to see the democratization of values, I think, and while there are noble companies out there, is if we create rules of the road that enforce certain safety measures like we've seen with other technologies.